Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are talking all about Paphiopedilum orchids and how they grow. Excuse you. About 6 years ago, I started this pretty infrequent series called The Growth Pattern of. We started with oncidiums, and then we talked about cattleyas and vanda orchids, and I realized that I always wanted to do one for slipper orchids as well, and for whatever reason I never did. But you know what? Today it is time to address the pattern of growth of these orchids because it is quite different. It might not be what you expect, and if you don't know it, you might actually be a little bit worried. Look at this. This doesn't look fun, does it? Well, it's normal, and I'm gonna tell you exactly why. So don't forget to give this video a like if you do end up enjoying it, and why not subscribe? I post 3 times a week. And with that said, let us start with the beginning, or should I say with the ending of the flowering period and the beginning of the vegetative period. Alright, so if you've purchased your Paphiopedilum orchid from the flower shop, most probably you purchased it with a beautiful bloom. But like all flowers, the blooms on a Paphiopedilum orchid are not going to last forever, and a while after you will purchase it, you will notice that the flower yellows and becomes dry. Don't worry, that is absolutely normal. Just like with the Phalaenopsis and all the other orchids, flowers will eventually fade and the orchid will start growing leaves, roots, and all of those structures that actually support blooming. Now, most likely you will have a Paphiopedilum that has only one flower at the top. But on the market, there are other types of Paphiopedilums as well. Some of them have multiple flowers, others bloom sequentially, but no matter the case, when the flowers are completely done, this orchid does not branch out like a Phalaenopsis would. So at this point, when the flowers are all gone, you're absolutely safe to cut the flower spike. Paphiopedilum orchids bloom from the very top of their crowns, not from the side. They're actually not monopodial orchids, they're sympodial. So all you need to do is cut the flower spike as close to the crown as possible, like so. This will make sure that your orchid is not awkward to be around, that your pets or children or even yourself will not snag your clothes on the flower spike and bump over the entire orchid. You know how those things tend to happen? So the main reason for cutting that flower spike is our own comfort. If you don't want to cut it, you can obviously let it be. And if you're not sure if your Paphiopedilum is the type that blooms sequentially, just let the flower spike be and eventually it will completely dry off. It will not be green or purple anymore. It will be completely dry. At that point, you can rest assured that you can cut it. You're not missing out on any blooms. At this point, you might actually notice a new growth at the base of your Paphiopedilum. If not now, then soon after the flowers are done, a new growth will appear from the base of the fans. As I was saying, these orchids are sympodial. Even though they don't create pseudobulbs, consider these fans as their pseudobulbs. They are connected through a rhizome, and their growth is actually very similar to that of an oncidium, minus the pseudobulbs. So at the base, you will see a little nub forming, which in time will start to leaf out. You will be able to distinguish the leaves. Each leaf will grow a little bigger than the previous one, until you will notice the new growth having very similar dimensions to the mother growth. Now, this process can take a little bit, and this will vary greatly depending on the variety. If you have one of these varieties, which you can find in flower shops, the beautiful mottled leaves, modiaes, the process doesn't actually take way too long. It can take about a year to a year and a half for that new growth to completely mature and be able to bloom again. But there are some Paphiopedilums on the market that grow excruciatingly slow. And one of these is my Paphiopedilum Rothschildianum. I have this one for about 2 years already, or 2 years and a half. Mind you, it was kind of tiny when I acquired it, and at maturity it is quite a big orchid. It is also a sequential bloomer, but the sheer waiting around, oh my goodness. So depending on the variety, you are looking at a year to maybe 3 years, or maybe a little bit more, until that new growth matures and is able to produce flower spikes as well. During your wait, it is important to offer the proper care and culture for these orchids so you don't experience even more setback. Paphiopedilums are known to not be very fast growers, and you really don't want to add to the weight. Luckily, care is actually pretty simple, pretty easy to offer in your home. I do have quite a few tutorials, even a more practical approach on these orchids. Check them down below in the description if you're new to Paphiopedilums in general. So if you are an impatient grower, which I know I can be sometimes, it might be a good idea for you to go for a mottled leaf Paphiopedilum, or one that has a lot of beautiful interest on the leaves as well, just to make the waiting a little bit sweeter. Yes, the flowers are amazing, but with these orchids, foliage is a main attraction as well. I do believe some people grow these orchids mainly for their foliage, not necessarily their blooms. But you have to know something. In my experience, the Paphiopedilums with the most beautiful foliage don't necessarily put on the most showiest bloom show. The sequential bloomers and multiflorals are typically those that have plain green leaves, like I showed you the Rothschildianum. And the ones that produce mottled leaves, they usually don't have as many blooms. The flowers are still gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but the bloom show, is not so spectacular. If you are thinking to purchase your first Paphiopedilum, think about this aspect. Think about waiting around for this orchid to bloom. If you know you can wait, maybe consider multiflorals. They do take pretty much the very same care. I personally don't find any difference between them. But if you're not good with waiting, go for a mottled leaf one. I assure you, they are a joy to look at every day. So after a while of waiting around, happy day, your new growth matures and you can start to see a flower spike forming. As I was saying, the flower spikes come from the very top of these fans, and they start off like a pretty out of place leaf. Especially with the mottled Paphiopedilums, it's easy to see when a flower spike is formed because typically the sheaths or leaves surrounding the bud are darker in color. Of course, they will depend on variety, but as a general rule, look for a type of leaf that has a very different pattern, even a different shade of green, even a different coloring. And most probably, that is the first sheath that surrounds the bud. At this point, it can take 1 or 2 months for the bud to completely form, again depending on variety, but it will be very exciting for you to watch your orchid every day grow up this flower spike while the fans themselves stop growing altogether. And here's the thing, when a Paphiopedilum produces its flower spike, it will stop creating leaves. The fan will never grow again actually, and when the new fan's bloom will be spent once again, the cycle begins once again and you will start to see new growth developing at the base of your Paphiopedilum. Now here's the scary part. As you can see, my Paphiopedilum looks a little bit suspicious. Well, don't worry, that is pretty normal. Because the flower spikes are terminal and these fans don't actually do anything after they bloom, what happens is they transfer all of their nutrients and energy to the newer growths. And in time, these growths will just yellow, they will deplete themselves, and they will pretty much disappear one leaf after the other. And that is absolutely normal, but it can be a little scary if you're not acquainted with their pattern of growth. So don't worry if that happens, it's a little unsightly. Some people choose to cut these leaves when they see they're yellowing or they don't have a beautiful pattern on them anymore. I personally, for my hobby, choose to leave these leaves alone because, as I was saying, they do transfer their nutrients to the new growth. They help out the new growth, just like a pseudobulb helps out new growth in the case of the Oncidium. Well, in this case, they actually deplete themselves. So I let them be, and when they are completely done, maybe something like this, that's when I consider removing them. They don't actually have an abscission line, so they don't come off very easy, so you will actually have to cut them with a sterilized pair of shears as close to the base as possible, like so. In my experience, leaving the leaves completely dry out will not make things easier. You can see that I tried to remove this one and actually ripped the leaf. So with most of these guys, you'll probably need scissors or a cutting tool to remove the leaves. Like with any orchid, anomalies can and will happen at some point the more Paphiopedilums you have and the longer the period of time you grow them. For example, some Paphiopedilums decide to produce a new growth from the very top of their crown instead of a flower spike. It is not something that usually happens. I just had it happen to me once in about 7 years, so I cannot say it's common, but I did have something like this happening, and I did film the process and how I managed to save that growth, so check the description for the links towards that video. The problem with creating growth on top of the crown is that the roots don't actually grow in soil. And Paphiopedilums don't grow aerial roots. The roots actually completely dry off if they are not in contact with moisture pretty much at all times. Second, I think you can see one of my Paphiopedilums has 2 growths that are going to bloom. It doesn't actually have 2 growths from the very same mother fan. It's one after the other, but this particular growth decided not to bloom last year. It decided to skip a year, produce another new growth, and they're both blooming at the same time. This is not typical behavior for a Paphiopedilum, but again, it happens. And I'm pretty sure that the longer the time you grow them and the more varied your collection of slipper orchids will be, the more little anomalies you will discover. After all, we are dealing with live things. They do have a little bit of a mind of their own, and especially if they're hybrids, genetically speaking, they might be a little bit mixed up in there and not grow like they naturally should. Each fan can create 1 or multiple new growths. Most commonly though, you will have 1 to 2 new growths. Due to how slow they grow, it's not very common to have a specimen Paphiopedilum orchid. There are, however, a few varieties which grow a little bit faster, which produce 2 new growths instead of 1. And this is the case of the Paphiopedilum Judge Philip. It is a multifloral Paphiopedilum, and as you can see, I do have quite a few new growths here. I also have old growth depleting, but at this point, it is camouflaged by the new growth. Generally speaking though, Paphiopedilums are not the orchids to go for if you are looking for big, bushy specimens. You are more likely to have this happen with Oncidium types, with Cattleyas, not necessarily with Paphiopedilums, but of course, if you're looking for one that can bush out like this, do your research, Google it, see what species or hybrids are more prone to creating multiple growths, and you can actually have a big bushy plant such as this one. Obviously, the bushier the Paphiopedilum, the more flower spikes you'll have as well, the better the show. And that is about it on the pattern of growth of these orchids. Again, if you're interested more on the care and culture they require, you will find more information in the description below. I will add as many videos that I did on these orchids as possible. But if you were ever wondering about them, well, I hope this video helped you out, and I do hope that you give them a try if you have been thinking about acquiring one for a long time, but you didn't know if you should make the plunge. Oh, definitely do. I don't find them very complicated at all. They're actually very similar to Phalaenopsis in care and culture. They just happen to grow quite differently, but hey, that's the fun of orchids. They're all just so diverse, you can never actually get bored growing them. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!